Hello everyone and good morning. My name is Kamil Jakubiak. I work as IdentityIQ architect in Ventum Consulting Company. Today I will be talking about IdentityIQ data model, hibernate, and basically the way how we can use it in a very flexible way to extend it whenever we need. But also I will show you what are the pros and cons of this solution, right? So today we are gonna talk about what are the standard IdentityIQ objects, right? What they are about, and basically what do we have there. We will create our own custom hibernate object called business application. I will try to pretty much explain you the use case when and how it can be useful for you. And of course, I will try to answer the most important question: how, when, and why should you do that? On the very end of this presentation, I will generally show you risks and benefits of this solution, and as a summary, I will try to wrap everything up, just to have everything kind of in one place, right? Okay, so let's first start with the standard IdentityIQ objects, right? What do we have out of the box, right? I think everyone who's got some experience with IdentityIQ knows about identity, knows about link, knows about bundle, and so on, right? But I don't know if you knew, it's not the closed list of objects that you might have, right? So you can actually create your own whenever you need, right? That's why we have something called object relational mapping. Basically, I would like to stop here for a few seconds, right? To basically have like certainty that everyone knows what object relational mapping is and how that works. So you know that on one hand side, we have a database with tables, columns that are storing the data somehow. But also, you know that in IdentityIQ bin shell, you never really use SQL queries, right? You want to get an object, you just make context get object by name, get object by ID, search, whatever you need, right? You can search for objects, you can get objects, you can copy them, get access to all the fields that you have there, whatever you really need, right? That's actually just because we have object relational mapping, which in IdentityIQ is implemented via the hibernate, right? So simply speaking, hibernate is responsible for mapping objects, which we know in the code, into the database tables, rows, and columns, right? So by default, as you know, we have identity, we have bundle, we have link. There's hundreds, I believe 143 standard SailPoint objects, which you can just use if you really need, right? So let's just spend some few seconds on the standard ones, right? So identity, what does identity do really in IdentityIQ? It's an object that generally describes an individuals, right? It keeps relation about permissions, about attributes, sources, and so on, right? Then we have managed attribute. That's simply speaking entitlement, right? It basically describes a group or some permission on the target system. Bundle is, of course, everyone knows it's a role, right? That allows us to aggregate entitlements into the more complex and more logical structures. And we have locations. Those of you who asked question, do we really have locations? All right, we don't, but that will be one of the tasks that we will be doing today. So yeah, stay tuned. Two questions. One I answered already. I think I actually answered both, but first one, do you know how many types of objects do we have available in IdentityIQ out of the box? And second one, if this number is closed. Do you remember 143? And number, of course, it's not closed, right? So what are the standard limitations that we have, right? We have identity, and identity is described generally by some attributes like first name, last name, whatever, right? What are the types of data that we can store within any object? Usually it's string, date, list, or whatever, right? But the amount of types of objects that we can store in a single attribute is quite limited, right? But the good thing is that it's not the limit that we cannot bypass, actually, right? By extending the hibernate model and data model that we have implemented in IdentityIQ. So for the sake of this presentation, let's think about business application. Of course, you know that this kind of object does not exist in IdentityIQ, like, completely, right? But it doesn't mean we cannot create it. So let's think for a few seconds about use case. Why can we need a business application, right? And let's make some very high-level design of it, right? So starting with that, what business application really is, right? Following Wikipedia, we can see that it's actually any software that we can use in the company, right? So I've had in my life already one customer which asked me to create a list of applications. There was 900 business applications. They were not necessarily standalone applications, but they might be integrated with Azure AD for rights management. They might be standalone. They might be integrated with some LDAP systems. Anything that customer needs, right? And the requirement is actually quite simple in this case. We need to store all the information in IdentityIQ because we might need to use it at some point of time, right? So our requirements for today is that we need to have a business application object, and this business application object should have an owner, have a custodian. These should be identities, generally speaking. It should have CMDB ID, which will be unique identifier, just a string, approvers group, approval mode, severity, and criticality, right? So approvers group can be actually a group of people that will be at some point of time responsible for approving something, either new request or remediation in certification, whatever is really needed. Approval mode can be actually information. How should the required permissions for the business application be approved? If they should be approved by the manager, or manager and owner, or just owner, or maybe security team, right? Everything depends, but this configuration will give us flexibility to configure this on the business application level. So why, how, when should we do that, right? So let's talk about different use cases that might happen before we jump into more details and more code of how to do that, right? So all the use cases that we might have ends up in preparations. We need to prepare the data model, right? On the left side of this slide, you can see that we have created the business application class, which simply on the first section contains all fields which we require, all fields that comes from our requirements, really, right? So we can see that there's custodian, there's approvers work group, we can see there's CMDB ID, approval mode, and so on, right? Then, in second part of this class, we are generating getters and setters. The good thing is that you don't need to do that manually, because most of modern IDEs just supports macros that are generating this for you. So you just click right button, usually on the class, and select generate getters and setters, and it's done, right? On the right side, you see already configuration and preparation of the data model for Hibernate. We have two important files that you need to, one of them you need to create, one of them is already there, right? So you see that in webinf classes, SailPoint object, business application.hbm.xml. In this file, you need to define a structure, which is actually what on the very beginning I called object relational mapping, right? So you need to simply inform Hibernate how particular attributes are mapped to a data model. So in our case, to a Java class which we are using, right? What you can see important in this fourth line of the class, we can see that our business application class, it's extending SailPoint object. That means, and I will show it a bit later, it will allow us to use our own class in SailPoint universe, right? But going back to the right side of this slide, you can see that in webinf classes hibernate.cfg.xml, you have one entry which says mapping, resource, and then actually you can see path to the file from the top of this slide, right? So that actually informs Hibernate that this additional file, which we just created a couple of minutes ago, right, needs to be added into the standard list of objects which Hibernate is loading to the memory when IdentityIQ is actually starting, right? So yeah, that's the first step. Second step, we need to generate a database structure for what we are doing, right? So you know that it's not that simple usually to create all the database tables from scratch, or to do that like completely manually, because it's hard to maintain indexes, to make stuff correctly with foreign keys and so on, right? So that's one of the best features we get with extending Hibernate the way I just showed you in the first step, because as you can see on the left side of the screen, you can just use standard SailPoint out of the box engine to generate the schema, right? So the same way as you are generating schema when you are installing fresh IdentityIQ. What's important you need to do, you can see first two lines of this screen, right? It says that we are copying actually businessapplication.class, which is our compiled class, to a directory which should hold it, right? So we need to put it into SailPoint IdentityIQ installation directory, webinf classes, and into the package which is created, which contains the class itself. And then once we execute IAQ schema, you can see that SailPoint is just generally creating schemas for all possible databases, right? And on the right side, you have an example of the DDLs that are generally created. What you can see here, it's not only SPT underscore business application, right? You can see it's the SailPoint followed naming convention, because all SailPoint class columns basically and tables are the names of this of the tables are starting from SPT underscore. You can see we have some additional attributes like owner, like created, like modified. We didn't define them, right? Anyone knows why? Yeah, those of you who say SailPoint objects are right? Because we extended SailPoint object, and these are the fields which are available by default, right? So we have SailPoint object attributes plus the attributes which we just created, right? So we can see on the DDL we have ID created, modified, we have owner, but also approvers work group, but also CMDB ID, approval mode, and so on, right? But on the bottom of the screen, you can see the most important part. We have a foreign key relation to the identity, right? That means that in this case, we just configured that the owner field, it must be in relation to the identity table. That allows us generally to keep everything in synchronization, right? So yeah, now we are after step 1, after step 2, let's do something out of that, right? So in step 3, we can create the object, and that's the most interesting thing of the whole story I'm talking to you right now, right? Because you can see that we can just import developer days.sailpoint.object.businessapplication. Remember, that's the class which we've created on the very beginning, yeah? And you can see in line 12, we just create an object, and like we do with every single SailPoint object, we have all setters to set name, set owner, set approval group, set approval mode, set CMDB, criticality, and so on. And then, most important part of the whole story, line 20, you can see we are just using SailPoint context to save the object, right? Now, after we execute this rule, what will actually happen, SailPoint IdentityIQ engine will communicate with Hibernate to store information in the database table which we've created in step 2, right? That's the most useful thing you can do. You most probably ask why, right? So I will show you in next step what you can do with that, right? As I told you, we are extending SailPoint object on the very beginning, right? That means that we can actually use all SailPoint native engines and mechanisms to get object from the database. And you can see that in line 8, we just defined the name of our business application. It's SailPoint devs, right? And then what's actually interesting, in line 12, you can see we are executing context get object by name business application.class business application name, exactly the same way as we did it for owner and for approvers work group. What's more, in line 14, right, and line 15, you can see that we can use query options and projection queries to get only these objects that we really need. And as you see in line 17 and 19, we can get iterators or lists the same way as we are getting all native IdentityIQ objects, right? So let's just summarize a bit what we just said, right? We can extend identity model in hibernate level with any object we want. What we need to do in first step, we need to prepare the data model by from one hand side creating the class. Then we need to modify the hibernate files to include the class and mapping to the class in the way that we want. And then actually in second step, we need to generate schema, load it to the database, and we are done, right? So we can start using what we just created. Extending of hibernate will not take you, I believe, more than half an hour. But can you imagine storing this kind of data right now by executing SQL statements directly to the database? I'm not even talking how risky that would be, right? But how time consuming would it be? How much stuff you would need to handle, transactions, rollbacks, exceptions, everything, right? So that's something that can speed up your life, really. And the most important, it allows you to store in IdentityIQ data that you would not expect to have them at all, right, on the beginning, yeah? So, yeah, just few exercises for you guys if you want to make some training and see how to do that. You can create a location object. You remember on one of the slides on the beginning, I showed you that we have location object, which is of course not true. Just try to create the location object. Let's say you have required attributes like street, country, state, zip code, and the janitor, which will be identity in this case, right? And if you have some more ambitions, I can give you a challenge task. Create location field in the IdentityIQ identity model to store not location ID or location name, but really location reference into this field. Don't be afraid. After this video, I will put the code snippets with both solutions, so with business application class and location class, into the SailPoint developers forum thread about this topic. So that's where you can find, I believe, recording of this video and link to the GitLab where you can find the code. And you can just compare if what you did is exactly the same thing as I would did. But yeah, that's the solution, right? We need to now think more high level about the whole stuff we just did. No doubt it will work, but let's think about risks and benefits of the whole integration and of the whole modification, right? So risks, right? Upgrades. That's the greatest risk of doing what we just did. Because in a lot of cases, SailPoint together with new versions changes either version of Hibernate or structure of Hibernate files. That means whenever you will be doing upgrade later on, you need to be very, very, very careful and checking if any of the changes are either overwritten or removed, right? That also means that during upgrade process, actually during patching process also, but it's more unlikely that during patching process Hibernate files will change than during upgrade from, for example, 8.3 to 8.4, right? But anyway, you need to be very careful in case of regression testing, because you need to ensure that your data model is stable, whatever happens, right? That's risk. But we also have benefits, right? So the first one that comes to my mind is, of course, flexibility, right? Because you can actually store whatever you want. As I told you on the beginning, I created business application for one of my customers to just keep the list of the business applications in IdentityIQ. But once I did it, actually we found a lot of use cases how this business application can be utilized, right? For example, we can bind other objects like roles, like managed attributes into this business application, and depending on business application, we can drive the approval process differently, right? So you can imagine you have like 900 applications in the company. All of them are integrated with Azure for group management, but each of these groups is different, right? And each of these applications is different. And one day your customer asks you to make a certification for owners of business applications. That feature actually allows you to assign managed attribute or role to the business application, and with this knowledge you already have list of approvers that you need, or reviewers, right? So that's one of these quite useful use cases, but let's talk about different one. Second task I showed you, right? Or your homework, let's say so. Location DB, right? Or database of locations. Usually if you want to build database location with all interface forms to manage, it might be quite costful project, right? I mean, it might take quite some time to build everything from scratch. With IdentityIQ, although it's completely not related to identity management, right? You can actually do that within a day or two, because you just define location object, create a very simple workflow with one form and one step to simply allow users to manage locations. Later on, for example, you can use a REST API to get this data, because remember, you have this data in the standard IdentityIQ schema, right? That means you can also use the standard API to get it out of it. So that can actually help you to fulfill not necessarily identity management related features, right, or requirements. But let's think about challenges a little bit, right? Because it's not that, extending hibernate model is either risk or benefit. There are some stuff that might be a bit complex, right? So something that you need to think through before you go into this direction, right? So object management. Unfortunately, even if you create your own object, this object will not be available in the debug page. So that means that you need to most probably create your own workflow or forms or any process that will allow you to manage these objects in your way. Lifecycle. You need to take into consideration what will be the lifecycle of these objects. When they are created, when should they be deleted, deactivated, whatever, right? But actually what you can do, and that's the greatest thing of the whole integration, right? You can use SailPoint workflow for everything. You can store the data, you can modify the data, you can remove the data. Finally, you can make track of all changes via SailPoint approvals, right? So that's something that might be a challenge, but it's like more topic for consideration when you decide to do something like that, right? Yeah, like I told you a few seconds ago, real life use cases, right? We have business application based approvals. So whenever managed attribute or bundle role is assigned to a certain business application, it can get a certain approval mode. You remember when we were creating our business application class, we actually had a field which was called approval mode, right? That's actually quite simple now to modify LCM provisioning workflow to calculate approval schema based on the entry in the managed attribute you are requesting, right? You can also differentiate connectors from business applications, because some applications are kind of hybrid, right? They don't have only Azure permissions or only AD permissions, but they are like joined both Azure and on-prem AD. Or even more, sometimes some applications have some permissions inside of its own database and in Azure. And here you can actually assign business application to any connector you really want, right? So that's like a very, very powerful feature you can use. Also, you can make delegations, right? Because, well, in principle, data owner is responsible for approving requests, but sometimes it's not really data owner case, right? Because we can delegate it for the custodian who can do approval on behalf of the owner, but owner still wants to keep the yearly access certification process for himself. That actually also allows you to store like more than one owner on the object, right? So yeah, let's try to summarize basically what we said, right? We can use standard IdentityIQ data model in the way that it is created by SailPoint, but we need to agree on limitations. We can also extend this model a little bit by creating our custom objects, custom classes, with actually much more flexibility, right? But from the other side, we need to have in mind risks and challenges that are waiting for us, right? Right after we decide to start using this this solution, right? So a lot of people is asking me, why do I like IdentityIQ so much, right? That's maybe kind of marketing slide, but as you see with presentation I did so far, the biggest benefit is flexibility, right? Second biggest benefit is also flexibility. You can see that actually there's nothing that is not impossible, or anything you want, you can implement. It's more a matter of thinking this through with all risks that you might have together with that, right? And the most important, the open universe, right? So yeah, you can write a small piece of code that will do something that you really want, and it's just working. So yeah, that's my presentation. I hope you really enjoyed it. And if you have any questions, feel free to post them into the SailPoint developers forum thread just below the presentation topic. I will do my best to answer. And also, yeah, you will find the video from this presentation together with the code snippets there. I hope soon. Thank you.